Welcome to the intersection of wildlife and human population session at the Animal Legal Defense Fund's virtual Animal Law Symposium. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Danny Waltz, and I am a managing attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Bridget Von Holtz is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton University. Bridget's research goal is to unravel genotype-phenotype evolution in both the naturally and artificially evolving species, like the North American red wolves. She is specifically interested in the interaction of natural history phenotypes and gene expression changes and their regulation via epigenetic variation. Zack Strong is a senior staff attorney with the Terrestrial Wildlife Program at the Animal Welfare Institute. He works on a variety of wildlife issues, including fur farming, trapping, international trade, conserving threatened and endangered species, and promoting human-wildlife coexistence. Dr. Michelle Lute is the National Carnivore Conservation Manager for Project Coyote, overseeing the organization's programs and campaigns across the country. Michelle is a conservation scientist and dedicates her professional life to promoting human-wildlife coexistence through effective public engagement, equitable participatory processes, and evidence-based decision-making. Thank you all for joining us today. We will begin with a presentation from Bridget about genetic patterns across red wolf, gray wolf, and coyote populations.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about my work in North American canines, mostly in the context of conservation, but also in admixture. As a refresher, I wanted to remind you of the canines that we live with on our continent. So in North America, we have several wolf species. We're probably most familiar with that of the gray wolf and the Mexican wolf, which is a subspecies. But we also have the red wolf, which is extinct on the landscape as we know it, found mostly in captive facilities and zoos. But we also have this very ubiquitous canine, coyotes, and we find them everywhere, from our backyards to downtown Los Angeles, anywhere you want to look. Now, because coyotes are found everywhere, and I'm going to focus on red wolves, I wanted us to understand through the research conducted how these species have interacted over deep evolutionary time and also far more recently. This is a map that you see here. I've already pointed out some of the species, but this is an ecoregions map. So it gives us a sense of the habitat type that you find each of these species. And even though I just told you that red wolves are extinct from the landscape, they still have this partition in the map that shows historically where you would have found red wolves had they survived in the wild to today. So when we look back through the fossil record, there are actually fossils that date up to 10,000 years old that indicate where red wolves used to live in the southeastern part of the United States. The range actually was pretty expansive, from the southern tip of Texas, sometimes being documented all the way up to Maine. But the fossil record has been kind of tricky because a red wolf doesn't really always have a clear-cut morphology. The fossils can sometimes be confusing, and the way that they've been scientifically named has also had a very dynamic past. You can see here in the box that red wolves can go by several different names, from Canis rufus to Canis lycaon, subspecies of such. It's still debated as in what's the taxonomic history, but today it's recognized as its own distinct species. Now, over the past 100 or so years, the decline of the red wolf has been mostly because of humans converting landscape and fragmenting its habitat. But as the same time as humans were doing this, coyotes, which evolved in the central part of the United States, also expanded their range eastward. And as that invasion front started overlapping with the red wolf distribution, one of the other major threats to the red wolf species is that of hybridization. So in the past 100 years or 120 years, there's been several documented cases through the fossil record that coyotes and red wolves were hybridizing and having offspring, and those are reflected in fossil records. So a lot of the concerns for conservation of the species was through the loss of the genomic integrity. What was actually a red wolf? And to combat that, over the course of the past 50 or so years, the red wolf has gone through various status of protection with federal legislation. It started in 1967 under the Endangered Species Preservation Act, where the red wolf was listed, and then again was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1973 as a federally protected species. At that same time point, the decline was so severe that the government decided to establish a recovery program that included a species survival plan and captive breeding. So at the time that the endangered species list was established, the red wolves were one of the first species to undergo wild collection to help establish the founders for the captive breeding program. Now, this was conducted through a several year, so on the map here, it shows 4 years, but it was about a 7-year expedition between 1973 and 1977, where biologists went to the last geographic place where red wolves were found in the wild. And that is in the southeastern Texas, southwestern Louisiana. And they trapped everything that they could. They ended up trapping over 400 canines in search of red wolves, not hybrids, not crazy, like several generation offspring of such. They wanted red wolves. Over the 400 animals that they captured and measured, they took about 40 of them into captivity and let them breed to see if their offspring were also going to carry the red wolf traits. So they did this kind of pseudo breeding experiment. And from those 40 that they were breeding, only 14 met the bar of what was considered a red wolf species. So those 14 animals are now, or have been, the founders of all red wolves to date. Every animal you see in a zoo or captive facility are descendants from those 14 founders. The predominant region, so in this little map that's inset here, I highlight 3 national wildlife refuges here. And this is where most of the founders were trapped and transported for captive breeding. So keep that in mind. I'll bring them up again later. Now, the captive breeding was incredibly successful. The population has maintained about 250 animals in captive breeding since that started in the late 1970s. So on the left here, you see pictures of these adorable little red wolf pups born in the Point Defiance Zoo up over in Tacoma, Washington. And on the right, because of the success of the breeding program, the photo on the right will show you that the animals were then translocated and released to try to establish a wild population of red wolves in North Carolina. The star on the map below shows you exactly where this experimental population was established. The population was established with 8 animals released for breeding pairs in 1988 and have since been going strong until the past decade when the population crashed. But what I want to talk about is that in North Carolina, as well as any other place, we still have coyotes in the premise of those animals. And when we think about trying to discern what canine we're looking at, even if it's through a spotting scope or binoculars, no matter where you are on the continent, I always take a moment to say, what animal is that really? There's a lot of similarities between wolves and coyotes. And when you're looking at them from a distance, size can not always be the best indicator. You might have a young wolf that's the same size as an adult coyote. So it's often difficult to tell the difference between these species. And the phenotype variation is also pretty well specialized to the habitat they live in. So a gray wolf may look different if you're seeing this wolf in the Arctic versus the deserts of Mexico. And I only bring that up because when we see animals, we want to try to understand what they are by simply looking at them and looking at our guidebooks. And as an aside, I'm often sent pictures of canines or told stories about people's interactions with wildlife. And this is a picture I received from Ron Wooten, who's a wildlife photographer from Galveston, Texas. Now, this picture was a beautiful picture. I've just zoomed in because he sent me the picture of this canine sleeping on the landing strip at the airport in Galveston. And they have coyotes there. There are no red wolves in the wild anywhere. And that far south, there's not a gray wolf either. So this could only be a coyote. But the picture of the coyote makes me wonder, this is kind of a wonky looking coyote. And I don't usually respond to these kinds of emails because they could just be a rabbit hole. But I responded and said, you know what? I might bite. If you have a carcass or some roadkill, some sample that I could do some genetic sequencing, I'm curious to learn about this animal. So here's just a much cleaner picture from Ron Wooten. He takes very beautiful pictures of these animals. These are now, there are several coyotes that live on Galveston Island off the coast of Texas. And they look different from other coyotes. And I've handled a lot of coyotes. They just look proportionally different. Their ears are larger, their head is wider. I was curious. And after I conducted, and my group conducted a bunch of genetic surveys, we were able to estimate the ancestry part of these Galveston coyotes, because I wanted to know, maybe they're just dogs. Maybe they're dogs that have bred with coyotes. But here we see in a principal component analysis, a cluster analysis based on genetic similarity, that these Galveston coyotes are actually situated in between groups. There's no group that they're actually a part of. And when we dive in deeper and quantify their ancestry, they have about 70% coyote genetics and about 30% red wolf genetics, which blew my mind. So we started to look at a much larger framework for explaining how are these Galveston animals carrying so much red wolf genetics when red wolves have been absent from the landscape for the past 40-something years. And our most likely explanation is that the red wolf ancestry comes from past hybridization. And I'm going to give you a cartoon of what I mean by that. Let's imagine that we have two species, the red species and the brown species, and they're diploid, but they only have one pair of chromosomes for sake of explanation. If those two species mate, that's a hybridization event, and they produce a first-generation hybrid offspring. And because of Mendelian inheritance, we know that they should receive 50% of their genes from the red species and 50% from the brown. Now, in the case of something like the Galveston coyotes and red wolves, we know that red wolves are going to be quite rare on the landscape up to the point that they went extinct in the wild. So this F1 hybrid is almost certainly going to find a mate that is a common species or a coyote at this point. So this is called a backcross, where now the F1 is breeding with the more common species and still, though, can transmit a little bit of that red wolf ancestry. Now, this is a more complex animal in terms of genomic ancestry. This backcross could mate with an F1, it could mate with a coyote, it could mate with another backcross. And over time, this is a very complex process that leads to a mosaic structure of ancestry. All these little blocks now have different ancestry identities, but we can sequence that and know that across the genomes of these animals. When we take a step back and look out at different states in the geographic area around Galveston, we can quantify the amount of red wolf ancestry, and that's what these little pie charts refer to. Each state has an average percentage of coyotes that either carry red wolf genetics, coyote genetics, or gray wolf genetics. And we see that there's kind of this enrichment of red wolf ancestry in Texas, Louisiana, and some of these like Appalachia states more to the east. So I'm really curious about Texas and Louisiana. We already know something about Galveston. And if we dive in deeper, so we've done a more geographically dense survey of coyotes in Texas and Louisiana. And again, these pie charts reflect this incredible abundance of red wolf genetics. I also have overlaid on this map those little black stars at the bottom. And if you remember how I told you, in order to find founders for the red wolf captive breeding program, they went in search of all these last remaining red wolves. And these black stars indicate the locations where those founders were captured and taken into captivity. So we kind of have this hot spot in the sort of corner of Texas and Louisiana. Ultimately, what we've been able to describe is that these coyotes are reservoirs of red wolf genetics. Some animals carrying up to 60% or 70% of red wolf ancestry, which is phenomenal. And we may start asking ourselves, should we call them coyotes, or are they actually now red wolves with a little bit of coyote genes in them? And we also have been documenting that these animals carry genetic variation that you don't find anywhere else, not in red wolves, not in gray wolves, nowhere else. So perhaps this is still that ghost genetics that are left over from the animals, the ancestral red wolves before they went extinct in Texas and Louisiana. To end this, I have a couple ideas on where we can take this in the future. There's always talk about cloning or gene editing to bring in those fragments of red wolves that we find from coyotes and somehow reconstructing this red wolf genome. So biotechnology is pushing conservation methods into an arena that we haven't seen before, but is very exciting. And the other mission I have is to help us think more positively about admixture and hybrids. They are of absolute value and represent sort of an underappreciated and overlooked part of evolutionary change. In early January, there was a New York Times article that was focused on our work in Galveston. So I just wanted to show you a few of those pictures. And it was a really great story indicating how we have to have this moment of coexistence. And as these coyotes are living in and amongst town, so this is a picture of a coyote in Galveston, which is a densely populated beach town, that these animals, even though many people might think they're just coyotes and are pests, they actually have this really incredible, important genes that they carry with them. So Galveston Humane Society is working on coexistence methods for managing, so non-lethal management. And we're trying to raise the awareness that hybrids have a value and they're important for the ecosystem as well as conservation efforts. So here's another town shot of one of these coyotes running around at night. And as I said, we're working with the Humane Society. They also pick up roadkill and they've been collaring animals for us too. So whenever we have a chance, we go down and visit them. And here's a colleague and myself checking out one of the roadkill animals from the freezer. That project is culminated into an actual organization where if you want to keep tabs on what we're doing, visit our project website. If you feel like donating or buying merchandise, there's that option too. But we have podcasts and newsletters and lots of photos that we deposit here for everyone to see. So I want to thank you all. There's lots of people involved, and I'm excited to take any questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zack Strong, a senior staff attorney with the Animal Welfare Institute based in Bozeman, Montana. And I'm going to give a very high-level overview of recent developments regarding gray wolves, wolf management, and wolf conflict prevention at the federal, state, and ground levels. First, just to orient ourselves geographically, I'm not going to focus on wolves in Alaska or Mexican gray wolves in the Southwest. And instead, I'll focus on wolf-related issues in the rest of the lower 48 states. This map from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service shows the approximate historical range of wolves in the lower 48 in light gray. And it shows how dramatically wolf range had contracted into just the northeastern corner of Minnesota by the time wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1978. And the darker gray shows the approximate current distribution of wolves in places like the Northern Rocky Mountains and Western Great Lakes states. Next, just to also orient ourselves to the current legal status of wolves, we can see from this map that wolves in the Northern Rockies region are not currently protected by the ESA and are subject to state management, while wolves in Minnesota are listed under the ESA as threatened, and wolves in the rest of the country are listed as endangered. So starting at the federal level, there are a few recent wolf-related developments I'd like to touch on. First is the issue of national wolf delisting and subsequent relisting. So in November 2020, the Fish and Wildlife Service finalized a rule delisting wolves across most of the lower 48 states, effective January 2021. That rule did not affect wolves in the Northern Rockies, which were already delisted, as we've seen, or wolves in the Southwest, which remained endangered, but it affected wolves across the rest of the lower 48 by returning wolf management to the states. However, a little over a year later, in February 2022, in response to legal challenges brought by a number of conservation organizations, a federal court vacated the rule and restored ESA protections. Among other shortcomings, the court held that the service failed to adequately consider the threats to wolves outside the core Western Great Lakes and Northern Rockies populations, the best available science about the distinct genetic characteristics of West Coast wolves, and the impact of lost historical range on the status of gray wolves. Next, while the National Wolf Delisting Rule was being litigated in May and July of last year, several wildlife organizations also petitioned the service to relist wolves in the Northern Rockies, due especially to anti-wolf legislation enacted by Idaho and Montana, which we'll take a look at in a couple minutes. The ESA requires that within 90 days of receiving such a petition, the service must make a finding as to whether it presents sufficient information to indicate that the petitioned action may be warranted. And so a few months later in September, the service found that the petitions did present such data and that relisting the Northern Rockies population may be warranted. And as a result of that finding, the service must next determine within 12 months whether or not relisting is in fact warranted. Meanwhile, in Congress, in January of last year, Representative Tiffany out of Wisconsin introduced the Managing Predators Act, which would essentially permanently exclude gray wolves in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wyoming from ESA protections. And in March of this year, Senator Johnson, also from Wisconsin, introduced a bill requiring the service to delist wolves in the Western Great Lakes states and exempting that rule from judicial review. Then on the appropriations side, last month, of course, President Biden signed a spending bill funding the government through the remainder of fiscal year 2022. And that law included a little over $1 million for USDA Wildlife Services to hire employees to implement non-lethal measures to prevent conflicts with wolves and other wildlife. And that's significant because Wildlife Services is well known for relying largely on lethal control to address conflicts with wolves and other wildlife and killing hundreds of thousands of native animals every year. That appropriation was advocated for by 2 conservation groups and is in addition to another $1.38 million that they have also secured this year and the previous 2 years for Wildlife Services to conduct non-lethal conflict prevention. So while much work remains to be done to reform Wildlife Services, particularly in the context of wolves and other predators, this is an important first step in the right direction. And notably, as a result of this funding, the agency has for the first time developed a non-lethal initiative for livestock protection that so far involves 13 states. The appropriations bill also provided $1 million to the service to administer its wolf livestock loss demonstration program. The program was established in 2009 and distributes funding to states and tribes to help pay for non-lethal conflict prevention measures and compensation for livestock losses due to wolf depredation. For example, you can see in this table the amounts distributed to states under the program in fiscal year 2020, with 10 states receiving funding for non-lethal conflict prevention and 7 for depredation compensation, with Arizona, Idaho, and New Mexico having received the highest amounts. Turning next to the state level, I'm going to touch on some recent developments in 4 states: Idaho, Montana, Wisconsin, and Colorado. Starting in Idaho, in May of last year, the state passed Senate Bill 1211, which was essentially designed to reduce Idaho's wolf population of about 1,500 by around 90%. The law authorized wolf trapping and snaring to occur on private property year-round, individuals to purchase an unlimited number of wolf hunting and trapping tags, wolves to be hunted by bait, over bait, wolves to be hunted at night with spotlights and night vision equipment, private contractors to be hired to kill wolves, and substantial increases in state funds directed specifically toward killing wolves. I don't yet have the data for this year, but at least as of the end of last year, the law did not actually seem to be having the intended effect. The number of wolves killed from July to December last year was 300, which was a little higher than the same period the year before, but actually a little lower than 2019. Around the same time last year, Montana was also passing a number of laws expanding wolf hunting and trapping, including bills that authorized the snaring of wolves for the first time in the state, extending the wolf trapping season, allowing wolf trappers and hunters to be reimbursed for the expense of hunting and trapping wolves, and allowing night hunting, unlimited killing of wolves per permit, and the use of bait to hunt and trap wolves. Also, like Idaho, however, the laws so far have not seemed to have the intended effect. 273 wolves were killed during the most recent hunting and trapping season, which was actually fewer than the numbers killed over the last 3 seasons. However, that number includes an unprecedented 25 wolves who primarily lived within Yellowstone National Park, who were killed when they ventured outside the park's boundaries. Looking next at Wisconsin, where the state held a very controversial wolf hunt last year. So again, the national delisting rule went into effect in January 2021, returning management to states like Wisconsin. Wisconsin law requires the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to hold a wolf hunt between November and February every year if wolves are not on the federal or state endangered species lists. And initially, the DNR planned to wait until November 2021 to hold a hunt, but it was required by a Wisconsin circuit court to move more quickly than that and to hold a hunt before the end of February. So in late February 2021, a hunt was held and 216 wolves were killed in less than 3 days, exceeding the quota that the state had set by nearly 100 wolves. The Wisconsin DNR began preparing to hold another hunt for November, but that was fortunately blocked by a different Wisconsin circuit court. And a few months later, wolves in the lower 48 states were relisted, preventing any hunting from moving forward, at least for now. Lastly, turning to Colorado, which does not have many wolves, but where wolf presence has been recently documented in the northwestern and north central parts of the state. In November 2020, Colorado voters narrowly approved a ballot initiative called Proposition 114. That initiative requires the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission to develop a plan to restore and manage wolves and to take steps to begin reintroducing wolves into the western part of the state by the end of 2023. Although that timeline could be extended because now that wolves have been relisted under the ESA, reintroduction will likely need Fish and Wildlife Service approval and the completion of an environmental analysis under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Finally, turning to wolf management and conflict prevention at the ground level, I want to touch on 2 issues that are major drivers behind calls for delisting wolves, laws designed to reduce wolf populations, and general anti-wolf sentiment. First are claims about impacts that wolves have on ungulates, especially like here in the Northern Rockies, elk. For example, many elk hunters and elk hunting outfitters in states like Idaho and Montana claim that wolves have decimated the elk populations, but there is little evidence of that. For example, elk populations are above or within the objectives set by wildlife managers in most elk management units in both Montana and Idaho. In addition to that, there are 8,000 more elk in Idaho and 30,000 more in Montana today than there were in 1995, the year wolves were reintroduced into the Northern Rockies. Moreover, research from places like Yellowstone National Park show that wolf presence actually has a positive stabilizing effect on elk herds, in part because wolves tend to prey on weaker or diseased animals. And lastly, of course, the other major driver of animosity towards wolves are claims about wolves' impact on livestock. Many ranchers claim that wolves kill large numbers of livestock, but in reality, wolves kill only a tiny fraction of livestock each year. For example, there were about 2.5 million head of cattle and 200,000 sheep in Montana as of January last year. But in that year, there were only 64 confirmed wolf depredations of cattle and 15 confirmed depredations of sheep. By comparison, tens of thousands of cattle and sheep die each year from causes such as disease, bad weather, and birthing complications. And further, lethal control is rarely a long-term solution to prevent wolf livestock conflicts. Instead, we can use a wide variety of effective non-lethal prevention measures. For example, herders or riders on horseback can be used to monitor herds and deter predators. Guard dogs and other guard animals can be very effective. And one of the most effective wolf deterrents is a specialized type of electric fencing called fladry, Fladry, which consists of an electrified wire draped with nylon flags that sort of flap in the breeze. It's a little difficult to see here, but this is a photo of fladry protecting cows from a wolf in Wisconsin. And this is another photo of fladry showing me on a ranch in southwestern Montana, actually showing a wildlife services employee how to set up fladry around a calving pasture. In the many dozens of fladry projects that I've been involved in several states over the years, not a single pasture experienced a wolf depredation while it was encircled with fladry. So it's pretty clear that we can live with wolves. And that's all I had. Thank you for your interest in wolves, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks to ALDF for inviting me to speak today, and to all of you for participating. So a little bit about me very briefly. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist, both a biologist and a social scientist, as well as an advocate and an all-around weirdo who is simply fascinated with the wild world and protecting it. I've worked and taught in many places, including Madagascar, East Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and of course, North America. I've studied primates, wolves, birds, so many species and ecosystems. And my real expertise and Project Coyote's focus is on maligned carnivores and their conservation. That's what I want to talk to you about today. We live in the Anthropocene, the age dominated by humans. It's a hot, hungry, and crowded world that we must share with each other and all life. The common thread and the greatest need is finding solutions for conserving biodiversity, protecting the vulnerable from the powerful, all the challenges and actions that fit under the umbrella of coexisting with wild nature. This, I believe, is the greatest challenge of the Anthropocene. One of the most controversial of challenges is the wicked problem of sharing space with the species that scare or inconvenience humans most. And so Project Coyote works to protect all wildlife, especially large carnivores like coyotes, cougars, bears, and wolves. So why coyotes? Coyotes are our namesake because they are arguably the most maligned species, with one coyote killed on average every minute. Much of our focus lately has rightly been on the terrible war on wolves being waged in places like Wisconsin, Montana, and Idaho. But at the same time, wildlife killing contests are often focused on slaughtering coyotes and other smaller mesocarnivores in vast numbers, and they occur any given weekend without any regulation across the country. You may just have heard of the exciting news that Representative Cohen and 11 of his co-sponsors just introduced federal legislation to ban wildlife killing contests on federal public lands. We've banned the practice in about 8 states, and we're hopeful those victories will propel this federal bill forward. But we need bipartisan support. So that's the next step. And just as an aside, if anyone has connections to moderate Republican representatives, we'd love to talk more about advancing that legislation and having discussions on that front. But back to my presentation. So why coexistence? Why are we asking this question about moving from conflict to coexistence? Coexistence has been the focus of my career. It's a focus of Project Coyote's work. But if you had asked me when I started out, when I was starting to study a PhD on wolves in Michigan, I would have said I was I was studying conflict, human-wildlife conflict. The field has traditionally focused on this concept of human-wildlife conflict, but that framing overstates and perpetuates a myth that there really is a lot of conflict occurring, when in fact, actual on-the-ground conflict between humans and carnivores is really rare. Coyotes mostly use our backyards without incident. Wolves taking livestock makes the news, but like most news topics, it's because it's a rare event, not a common one. Livestock is mostly lost to weather, birthing complications, disease, and even theft. The question really is, how do we move from this conflict framework to actual coexistence with wildlife? And so to do that, we have to define what we mean when we're talking about coexistence. You might wonder, is this an overly academic pursuit to define coexistence? Don't we all know what coexistence is and what we're talking about? Well, based on my experience working with conservation professionals, advocates, the public, I would argue, no, we don't yet totally agree. And that's in part because we're still shaking off an old notion of fortress conservation, that critters with big teeth are best conserved in protected areas where we've kicked the humans out. Well, as I alluded to in the beginning, we don't have the luxury, and perhaps never did. We have to share our backyards, our city parks, our county open spaces with all forms of life, including those that might seem inconvenient to us. So how do we define coexistence and operationalize it in the real world? Well, my friends and colleagues, Carter and Linnell, started with a definition that I really like to use, that I think is very useful. They define coexistence as the dynamic but sustainable state in which humans and wildlife coadapt to living in shared landscapes. And I really want to emphasize every aspect of this definition because it's all really important. It's a sustainable state that we're aiming for, but we're acknowledging that the state is going to evolve and change. It's dynamic. And we're also talking about co-adaptation. That's a two-way arrow where humans are adapting to the presence of wildlife and wildlife are adapting to the presence of humans, their domestic animals, and their property. And this is all in shared spaces. So again, moving away from this notion of land sparing, of fortress conservation, where wildlife and wild nature are over here and humans are over here. Another definition I like to use is from my executive director and Project Coyotes founder, Camille Fox, as well as a number of our science advisory board members, who define coexistence as a mutually beneficial living arrangement that meets the vital needs of humans. And in this case, we're talking about large carnivores. I think this is also a really great definition. And they all try to fill the need that's occurring at the nexus of humans and wildlife, which is, again, maybe a false dichotomy to even be thinking about two separate entities in the nexus. But we're trying to address everybody's needs and find solutions to challenges that have traditionally been framed as conflict. So that's where one of our biggest programs comes into play. Carnivore Conservation and Coexistence is one of Project Coyote's umbrella organizations. So when we're talking about moving from conflict to coexistence, we're talking about on-the-ground solutions to allow humans and carnivores to share space. And first, we need bottom-up solutions. We need grassroots organizing and public education and outreach to change human behavior. These are the tools and methods that promote coexistence and make it easy, habitual, and broadly supported by society. But this work also entails top-down approaches, policy reform at federal and state levels. That's why I've included this photo of then President Nixon signing the Endangered Species Act. This is a foundational and highly important policy for conservation and coexistence, as I'm sure you're all aware. I also include it because it shows who decision makers were and still are to a large extent. But that's changing. And that's why I've included the next photo of this young man who attended a Michigan Department of Natural Resources meeting about wolf management. This photo just totally inspires me because this little guy was so brave in this meeting of all these adults that are gearing up to fight about how wolves should be managed in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And here he is speaking up for wolves. I also like to include this photo because he's the future and a major reason why the grassroots work is so important now. so that he can know and hopefully observe wolves and coyotes in the future. That's why we're also working with coalitions like Wildlife for All to change governance so power structures change and decision makers actually listen to all constituents. So people power will actually matter and make a difference in the future. That leads me to another program I'd like to just quickly note, Project Coyote's Keeping It Wild Youth Education Program. So this is where we work with educators to enhance environmental and wildlife focused curriculum in schools and various other education programs. And one of the ultimate goals of this work is not just to educate students, but to build a global citizenry to create empowered voices for the next generation. And some of these pictures show student groups that had gotten involved in our Keeping It Wild youth education programs and then spoke up and gave public comment at various meetings, commission meetings, and regulatory meetings. So this is one of our really exciting and powerful programs. We also have a science and stewardship program, and this really informs everything we do at Project Coyote, because science informs all our recommendations, all our identification of best management practices and policies. And this is a picture of our science advisory board meeting. These are world-renowned carnivore biologists, social scientists, and ethicists. Really exciting group of dynamic folks. The corollary, the complement to science, is art. So our Artists for Wild Nature program uses art and collaborates with lots of different kinds of multimedia artists to inspire change, to do the changing of hearts and minds that science only reaches so far. And so that's why we see this as a complement to our science and stewardship program. And then our Ranching with Wildlife program. So here's where we work with predator-friendly ranchers to implement the best coexistence practices on the ground. And again, science shows us that increasingly we can effectively rely on non-lethal as best management practices to prevent conflict before it ever happens. Science is also showing us that non-lethal does not work. So we've got really old tools like fences and flagging, shepherds, sometimes now called range riders in modern vernacular, and guardian dogs or other animals like donkeys. These are old tools that people have been using for a long time to protect domestic animals from wild animals. And we've got new tools and updates to these older ancient tools. So we've got ATVs sometimes instead of riding horses. We can cover more ground, perhaps. We've got solar-powered electrified fencing. We've got GPS collars. We've got fox lights and other scare devices that activate when they believe they sense a carnivore is near domestic animals. So we've got all kinds of tools to implement, and they're context dependent. But it's just a matter of encouraging their use and distribution. And so Ranching with Wildlife program really focuses on getting the word out there, and again, education for ranchers and farmers to know how to implement these best management practices for their specific operation. And in some cases, we still need to create new innovations and tools. That's why I've worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on their new program to award innovation prizes through the Theodore Roosevelt Genius Prize competition. If you want to know more, please follow up with me after this session, because I'd love to talk with you about opportunities on that front. And then lastly, our Coyote-Friendly Communities program. This is sort of our flagship program that's empowering residents with knowledge and tools to coexist with coyotes and other wildlife in their backyard. So this mostly entails securing food and dispelling myths about animal behavior, lots of public outreach and education just to let folks know, if you see a coyote during the day, that's not abnormal. She's not sick. Those sort of myths and the education to empower folks is really key. And it helps not only coyotes, but all kinds of wildlife that we share our backyards with. So education is key about how to prevent risk and also about the benefits of wildlife alive. So those two are the key components of our education programs through Coyote-Friendly Communities. So what can you do to help promote coexistence with carnivores? Here we are in mostly North America. Maybe we've got participants in other places, but wherever you are, you can help in your home, backyard, in your neighborhood. You can be an example to your neighbors by securing attractants, keeping companion animals under supervision and on leash, not using rodenticides, and sharing all those tips and things that you've learned and values for local wildlife with the people in your life. You can vote with food choices by avoiding meat and food with high embodied water usage. This not only helps fight climate change, but it helps carnivores and ecosystem resilience generally. You can vote with your dollars by supporting businesses that employ wildlife-friendly practices. And say you're planning a vacation out west, seek out businesses that support wolf recovery in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You can tell Montana and Idaho you won't visit their states or buy their products as long as they sanction wolf slaughter. But importantly, you can also help professionally. Nonprofits need diversity and creative thinking. We need new tools to collaborate with other environmental and social justice efforts. This won't be easy. This will take learning for everybody, but we have a lot to learn from other social justice efforts. And I think we can all advance our shared common goals by doing so. We need to find novel ways to reach beyond our traditional choirs. We've got to create communications to amplify diverse voices and create space for disenfranchised folks to lift up their voice. We have to hire BIPOC candidates. As a broad environmental community, we're still too white and privileged. And so this is a place where we just have to put our money where our mouth is. And this is also where we can support Wildlife for All and their work to reform governance structures. So if you're interested in more of that work and that coalition, I would recommend that you start by going to their website. It's wildlifeforall.us, and they've got great information on that front. You all know too well how important lawsuits are to compel government agencies to do their job. And we need to find ways to protect a number of species. So a couple of things that I've been thinking about and would really like to emphasize where we need to do more thinking. We need to find ways to protect red wolves and coyotes. We need to think more holistically about wild canids in ecosystems, not just one species or the other. Mexican gray wolves need to be considered essential and allowed above their arbitrary boundaries, such as Interstate 10 in Arizona. We expect the proposed new recovery plan out any day. So if you're interested in getting involved, reach out to our coalition, Lobos of the Southwest, or me, and I can help you get involved on that front. We need a national recovery plan for wolves and for grizzlies and permanent protections outside of the Endangered Species Act. So as fundamental and important as that act is, we see wolves and potentially grizzlies going on and off this list based on litigation, based on congressional riders and federal budget bills, like what happened with Northern Rockies wolves. So federal legislation has been talked about that would protect these species and also potentially bison permanently through a similar act to the Marine Mammal Protection Act or the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act or Migratory Bird Protection Act. So those could be models for a new federal legislation that would protect these species and put this predator pendulum to bed once and for all. We need to end the Mckittrick loophole once and for all. So this is the loophole that allows people to say, oh, I shot an imperiled wolf. I didn't realize. I thought it was a coyote, or the same thing. I thought I shot a black bear. I didn't know it was an endangered grizzly. So this loophole really needs to be ended once and for all. U.S. Department of Agriculture's rogue wildlife services program needs to be challenged. Especially, I think we have opportunities where states have mini NEPAs, like California's Environmental Quality Act, or where aerial gunning, M44s, trapping, and all the indiscriminate lethal arsenal endangers non-targets. I think we can use that as a legal hook. So looking at an endangered fox species or a species of greatest need or special concern in the state where there's really a legal hook to protect. We can say trapping endangers these species when you're targeting coyotes, and then we can get protections for all of these species. So as you know, regulations can change. Lawsuits can be reversed. So I want to end by emphasizing that this lack of longevity means the education to change hearts and minds over the next generation is still so critical, as is proactive, not only the programs that prevent conflict on the ground. These are the frontiers of the future of coexistence. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. And please reach out anytime. And my email is on this slide. Thanks again.
Okay, great. Now we'll move into the question and answer aspect of this session. I think we have about 20 minutes. Just as a reminder for everyone, you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom. We've already received some questions, which I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel. I'll start with a question that may be for everyone, or I'm hoping to hear from everyone. So today we've heard about captive breeding programs, reintroduction, and human wildlife conflicts. And I'm wondering if y'all could share your perspectives on what might be a controversial question. So if we know that a certain species, when reintroduced, like wolves, when reintroduced into a certain area, like for example Colorado, are likely to have some human wildlife conflict where they may be killed by humans, should we actually breed that species for reintroduction? How should we balance the ecosystem and species conservation values that might come with reintroduction against individual animals' interests?
I think it's a great question, and it's a really tough one. And I think there are lots of competing considerations, as you alluded to. On the one hand, we need to do everything we can to restore ecosystems, to bring balance back to ecosystems, to increase the places that are intact and can support wildlife across the country. And at the same time, we need to be thinking, though, not just at that ecosystem level, but also at the level of individual animals and what they're going to experience as a result of potentially being relocated or reintroduced. I think those are tough questions that my organization have struggled with in the context of red wolves as well, and I've thought a lot about it in the context of wolves being reintroduced in Colorado. And I think, for me, it comes down to the question of that we ought to ask, what is best for the animals, and is this particular place with its geography and its politics and what could happen to these animals as a result, what is going to be best for them? So that's not an answer yes or no, but I think some important things to think about as we're taking on these efforts.
I absolutely agree. If I might jump in, I think this is an area where we need ethicists and philosophers to help us unpack the questions about conservation and how we make decisions based on our values and based on science, because there are these competing considerations around apex predators bringing back great ecosystem health and resilience, but are we asking individuals to give up too much, individual wolves whose pack dynamics are going to be totally destabilized by lethal control when people respond to potential conflict? What are we asking individual animals and families to do in these situations? And that's not something, not a question that we've, in terms of a broader conservation community or as biologists, have asked too much. But I think a lot of people are now finding the voice to talk about and ask those questions. So I really appreciate the question. Again, don't have great answers, but I think we're going to have to find ways to balance those considerations, because increasingly postmodern societies, like we see in North America, want to consider the individual rights and claims of animals. So it's a really good question, and one that we need to keep talking about.
This aspect has entered into some of the recent discussions we have about thinking, when can the translocation and release of animals into a natural landscape, when can that be transitioned into a self-maintaining population or species? And that interaction with people has to be considered, because we do need to see that normal life history is maintained. If species disperse, if they get new territories, how they meet new mates, how they form packs, this has to be preserved. And as everyone has been saying, that impact from humans really need to be considered in order to ultimately transition from human management to a natural existence without us having to play the role.
Great, thanks. Bridget, I know that you've been an expert witness for the Animal Legal Defense Fund in a couple of recent cases in which you've analyzed the genetics of individual canids. Can you talk about how the experience of being an expert witness compares and contrasts to, say, academic work?
My daily job.
Yes.
Yeah, it was, so I had a really great time. I felt the frustrations of, because I don't get to work with individual animals really on much of my job. So to see, names of animals and what is being considered and how what I do can actually reach an individual animal, I found it really satisfying. And I say that because I think both cases have come out to be in a very positive, outcome where what I thought should have happened, based on the science, it seems like it did happen in that way. And so I liked it, but it's a new aspect of, I've never really experienced that with, writing a paper or talking to students about research. So it was really great. It put me outside of a comfort zone in many occasions, but still also very comfortable since it was dealing with data.
So Zack, you mentioned the lawsuit that vacated the delisting decision for wolves and restored Endangered Species Act protections for gray wolves. Do you have any updates on that? Has the federal government appealed the decision?
As I understand it, the federal government has filed a placeholder appeal so that it has the option of appealing that. But according to Secretary Howland, that is just for purposes of the placeholder. And I don't think there's been a decision yet about whether the government will actually appeal it or not. And I think rightfully there's a lot of pressure on the administration not to appeal it, because I think the reasoning of the district court was pretty sound. And, this was a delisting attempt made under the Trump administration that the Biden administration shouldn't continue to defend. Maybe this question is related to that lawsuit. You talked about how some Western states, Montana and Idaho, passed laws about wolves last year. Why did we see those states passing such aggressive wolf legislation last year and not earlier? And I guess, what does that say about how to strategically think about advocating for wolf protections? Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think with both states, there was some degree of feeling emboldened by the Fish and Wildlife Service moving forward with delisting wolves across the country, in a sense that, now is also the time to be even more aggressive towards wolves in Northern Rockies where they were already delisted. In Montana, we have seen these types of bills come across, make it through the legislature for many years now. But what's different now is that for the first time in Montana, in 16 years, believe it or not, we now have a Republican governor who himself is, a trapper and very, I would say, anti-carnivore. And I think that that conservative legislators in Montana finally saw their opportunity and knew that this was their chance to pass very aggressive legislation and actually finally get it signed by the governor as opposed to veto, which is what has happened for the last many years. So I think those combination of forces are why we saw this sort of sudden heightened level of aggressiveness in those couple states. A question that just came in, I'm not sure who would be best to answer this, so anyone can jump at this. Do American states and Canadian provinces that share wolf territory work together? Do they work together well? Or have there been gaps in collaboration for the best interest of wolves across borders? And I would expand this to, I think, Michelle, you were talking about Mexican wolves in the Southwest as well. If you could talk about the challenges of cross-border protection, both between states and also across international boundaries.
Sure, I can jump in, especially in the Southwest, where a lot of my experience has been. There's a lot of collaboration. There are biologists in Mexico that are studying Mexican gray wolves and doing their best to help recover the species. And there is some coordination, but obviously a border wall separating the species is a huge issue. And so that's where everybody's at a loss for how to backtrack from this giant step backwards with the border wall. But definitely there is coordination. Definitely there are challenges to coordination. So that's something that I think biologists are really trying to address really well in the Southwest, but are hampered by, federal actions.
I'll jump in and offer what I think is an interesting example of sort of international cross-pollination. There's an effort in southern Alberta called the Waterton Biosphere Reserve. And it's a community of ranchers who live and work on the outskirts of Waterton National Park, which is adjacent to Glacier National Park to the north in Canada. And the ranchers who work in that area approach ranching with large carnivores in a really interesting way, in that they have decided that within a certain sort of number of miles or within a certain periphery of Waterton National Park, large carnivore conservation will be prioritized over livestock grazing. And then beyond that, grazing may be more prioritized, but there's still an effort to live with and respect the carnivores that inhabit that area. And their coordinator is a guy named Jeff Bechtel, responsible for their kind of carnivore coexistence program. And he has come down to Montana and other states many times to speak about what they do. And I'm really glad to see him doing that, and think there's a lot that ranchers in Montana can learn and are learning and are taking from that program. And I wonder especially about how that might be applied to Yellowstone National Park, given especially what we saw recently with so many wolves being killed by hunters and trappers coming out of the park, and whether some kind of similar program could be agreed to by folks who live around the periphery of Yellowstone, and following that model that they've adopted in around the Waterton area.
One comment I have for the collaboration is that there's a recent example of work done both by Ontario in Canada and Great Lakes states, when wolves were taken from several locations, Ontario included, and moved to Isle Royal to help populate and maintain the population of gray wolf there. So that, I think, is several groups working together well enough to move animals and help monitor them as they continue to exist.
Very cool. And actually, I think this question that we just received might sort of tag on to your answers. One of our attendees says that wolves have become this politicized animal, and as such, they are can be treated with hatred and contempt. How do we go about depoliticizing wolves?
That's a tough one. I'll probably repeat myself a little bit, but I think looking to the next generation and, good environmental education and promoting coexistence tools are going to be key. Diffusion of innovation is slow for anything. Human behavior change is slow for anything. But the more and more we get community buy-in for preventing conflict and using non-lethal tools, the more the next generation of farmers and ranchers and people who are sharing their backyards with wildlife like wolves will see that it's possible, coexistences work, and that it can be done by everybody. But when it's novel, when you haven't had to do it, when your grandfather didn't have to do it, it's really hard to convince folks to try something new or something really old that hasn't been done in a long time. And that's where, science is so important, but it will not necessarily sway. If you go to a town hall meeting or a wildlife commission meeting, you can talk until you're blue in the face about scientific statistics, but that's not necessarily going to persuade people on the ground. They're going to say, okay, well, that study was done in another state, in another area that does not apply. And, local operations, it's very context specific what kind of coexistence tools you need to implement. So it's true that it can be very specific. So that's why, more and more collaboration and integration of these ideas and sharing of knowledge is going to be essential to depoliticizing wolves so that they're accepted member of the landscape that we share.
Yeah, agree with everything Michelle said. Really well put. And, I think one thing you learn in the world of coexistence work is that folks like farmers and ranchers, like Michelle said, are a lot less interested in being bombarded with facts and data and are a lot more interested in hearing from people and agencies and organizations that they trust, whether it's their neighbors or folks they work with or certain agencies. And I have always seen that as one advantage of trying to work with the federal agency Wildlife Services and to try to convince Wildlife Services to do more non-lethal conflict prevention work, because and I've done a lot of work with the agency here in Montana and other states, and I have seen the effect that can have, that when someone like me shows up to some ranch and suggests using flagery, I'd get laughed off the property. If Wildlife Services shows up with the same suggestion, it's much more likely that a rancher will be willing to try to use that tool. And I think that if ranchers are feeling as if agencies like Wildlife Services or others that they trust and are coming up with these sorts of effective solutions that are reducing the number of conflicts that they're experiencing, that can, I think, at least contribute to reducing the politicization of the species.
Great, thanks. Michelle, you mentioned in your presentation legislative work at the state and federal level to ban wildlife killing contests. Outside of the legislative arena, do you see any value or opportunities for other types of legal advocacy to stop killing contests? For example, through civil litigation or work with district attorneys to prosecute cruelty prosecutions or any other legal actions that lawyers who are watching might be interested in taking?
That is a great question. My first thought was it's so hard because currently there aren't regulations or laws really on these contests or protecting the species that are most often targeted. So a lot of the reform, has been around particularly banning contests, specifically around state commerce laws or around participating and organizing. And, the certain areas where we might actually be able to kind of enforce some sort of regulation. There's some thought that changing regulations around, unlimited take of these species like coyotes and bobcats, protecting them, or having at least a season or a bag limit. Obviously, we don't want any hunting of these species. So a lot of the thought around reform has been kind of, the rulemaking or legislative route. But it would be really interesting to explore with, I've got the science mind, so I need to talk to folks like you with the legal mind to think about, where does a state have great anti-cruelty laws that could set good precedent around these contests? That's a great idea. I don't have a better answer other than, we should be thinking about that more.
Then let's talk.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, please.
Great. This is the last question for anyone who wants to take it. If no one wants to jump at it, I'll ask someone. But do you think coexistence, as Michelle has defined it in her presentation, is achievable without mass extinction?
Well, I'll jump in. I was just typing an answer saying, yes, if I didn't believe it was possible, I'd probably retire and just live a nice, quiet life in some cabin in the woods and not spend all my time in front of a computer. But I do also appreciate the overwhelming vastness of the challenge. And, when you think about it outside of just carnivores, we're dealing with, mass extinction, biodiversity crisis, extreme weather, all of this stuff is really overwhelming. But I do think that there are unique opportunities to be met that are right around the corner. And, I say this as the daughter of 3 generations of farmers, but animal agriculture has to change, and the way we feed humans has to change. And I think systems are about to be really disrupted by new technologies around how we can meet protein resource needs. So I think that that's an area where we're really going to be able to address all of these overwhelming challenges. I think getting cows off public lands is important. I think having less cows and less animal protein is going to help ecosystem resilience. It's going to result in cleaner water. There's so many things that can get addressed, but it has to be done in a just way. Just like we've seen with the energy sector and coal workers, there have to be just transitions so that people can transition to more sustainable livelihoods. And we're already seeing that. Across the Great Plains, across the Midwest, across a lot of rural places, kids are not saying that they want to keep up with these jobs in ranching that they see aren't sustainable and aren't necessarily in line with all of their values. And a lot of people still do want to maintain those traditions and those livelihoods. So, we just have to have honest conversations about where can we maintain these traditions, where can we uphold those values while still giving people, livelihoods in the future that also meet all of these challenges. So it's really tough work. I think it has to be navigated really carefully, but that's one place where I think there's a ton of innovation, and we need to start talking about it now, because 20, 30 years down the line, it's not going to make money. It's not going to make sense to be making meat off the hoof, so to speak. I think because these systems are going to be so disrupted. So that's one area that's controversial, but I think has a lot of opportunity if we start thinking now about novel innovation and solutions.
Great. It's fun to end on controversy. Thank you for that. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Zach and Bridget, for participating on this panel. It was great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.